Our next speaker is Rumiko Handa. She is Professor of Architecture and Associate Dean at the University of Nebraska. I mentioned earlier her book, and I now have the full title for you, Allure of the Incomplete, Imperfect, and Impermanent, Designing and Appreciating Architecture as Nature, 2015 Routledge. And I just have read this book, and it's really fantastic and so related to many of the issues that come up here. I highly recommend it, and we're very happy to have you here. And the title of her talk is Time and Imperfection.
Thank you very much, Anne. You're very, very kind. And thank you, Ivan and Anne, for having me here. It's fantastic. I have to apologize ahead of time. I'm not a philosopher, so I might bastardize your terms without intention. As Anne said, my talk is titled Time and Imperfection, and I'm hoping to address the symposium's second set of questions that are on the website. How do we value? Oh, sorry. Right. How do we value or devalue, disvalue matters instability and impermanence? When is matters instability something to avoid, and when is it something to embrace? When does the matter's instability make a positive contribution to our experience of it, and what is the nature of this positive contribution? What values guide us in answering these questions? I would like to begin with a flower pot in the collection of Tokyo National Museum. It is made by tea master Senno Rikyu, who lived in the 16th century turbulent Japan, who served the powerful warlord Oda Nobunaga, and after Nobunaga was toppled by coup d'etat, went on to serve Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who eventually took control of all the feudal lords. Rikyu's life ended in 1591 in seppuku, the ritual suicide, by the order of Hideyoshi, who had been provoked by his tea master in the ways about which we can only speculate. Rikyu's name is well known in and outside Japan and often associated to wabi tea. Today, wabi is often paired with the notion of sabi, and the term wabi-sabi has come to designate general Japanese aesthetic inclination, which favors a simple lifestyle and authentic materials. The notion, on the one hand, is discussed at the levels from the rudimentary tourist guidebook to the scholarly philosophical discourse. On the other hand, the term wabi often is elusive, escaping definitive interpretation and analysis. Its meaning may be understood as the quality of an object that lacks something and thus invites the viewer to imagine its perfect state. The inscription on the back of this flower pot tells its name, Onjoji, and its signatory, Shoan, that's Rikyu's son. The name Onjoji is in reference to Buddhist temple of the same name, and in particular, its bell. There is a famous anecdote about this bell. The warrior monk Benkei, widely known for his physical size and strength, is said to have dragged this bell from the temple into the mountains and later ditched it into a lake. The bell's scars and cracks are said to be the results of that. The cracks on the flower pot were already there during Rikyu's time. It is reported that one day at the tea ceremony held by Rikyu, water was leaking from it and the raised floor was getting wet. A guest pointed this out to Rikyu, and Rikyu replied, "This dripping water is the life." It will be difficult to explain Rikyu's response, this dripping water is the life, if we were to define wabi just by the simple lifestyle and the use of authentic material. Only when we define wabi as the lack of something, we begin to understand it. What is missing in this case is the flower pot's very functionality, to hold water. But did Rikyu favor the lack of functionality in order to imagine the perfect, in this case, the perfect working order? In other words, how do we explain the life in this response? I am sure today's audience would have already thought that the life here is in reference to the nature of bamboo. It's porous, and when it is harvested, contains much water inside. But in time, the moisture evaporates, it shrinks, and cracks develop. The flower pot made out of bamboo then is under the influence of this law of nature that reveals itself in the course of time. Rikyu called this life or the unescapable truth. To put it further, for an appreciation of this life, Rikyu was willing to let go even of the fundamental utility of the flower pot. His predilection to let nature take over his craft or desire to submit to the forces beyond human control or his control can be found in other instances. Rikyu recommended sweeping the garden passage much in advance of the tea ceremony so that few leaves would have fallen before the guest's arrival. He also recommended keeping a spider web if found with morning dew. At this time, in order to further our understanding, I would like to introduce the notion of mujo, often translated as transience. The sentiment is expressed in this early 13th century literature written by Kamono Chome. It begins, the flower flows ceaselessly, and the water is never the same. And further, the mind that accepts mujo as the word's inescapable truth is teinen, which means the spirit of submission or resignation. A typical high school teacher in Japan in Japanese literature would make sure her students would understand teinen not as something negative, as in giving up or throwing in the towel. But instead, teinen is considered a state of enlightenment. And it is contrasted against meimo, which is the state of mind that is delusional or delirious. Why the spirit of submission is the state of enlightenment, and it is related to the notion of wabi, may be understood by the following explanation given by Okakura Tenshin in the early 20th century. He stated that wabi is, and I quote him, a cult founded on the adoration of the beautiful among the sordid facts of everyday existence. It is essentially a worship of the imperfect, as it is a tender attempt to accomplish something possible in this impossible thing we know as life. In other words, the adoration of imperfection in wabi is not just an aesthetic preference. Instead, wabi relates to the understanding and acceptance of the truth of life or the human existence in the world. From here, I would like to show two sets of buildings. Each set has one example from Japan and one from the West. In the first set, I see man at odds with mujo, transience, and in the second, man incorporating or even taking advantage of transience. I wonder if you see them in the same way I do. Rikyu's view of his art is in stark contrast to the notion of beauty held widely among architects, that a building is complete when construction is finished and that any subsequent alterations are degeneration. They strive to make the building perfect and wish to keep it so permanently. The root of this view is the Renaissance humanist polymath Leon Battista Alberti. In the architectural treatise, De Edificatoria, which he presented to Pope Nicholas V in 1452, Alberti defined beauty, is that reasoned harmony of all the parts within the body, so that nothing may be added, taken away, or altered, but for the worse. In coming up with this definition, Alberti was referring to Cicero's writing on rhetoric, and was drawing a corollary between architecture and oratory. Equating the architect with the author, Alberti would demand the author-architect to expand all his care and intellectual power on perfecting his work. In return, he would be willing to grant the authorial authority to the original architect and expect the work, once completed, to go down in the history unaltered with the author-architect's name proudly attached. Alberti advised a number of measures to keep buildings away from the nature's influence, which otherwise would alter the building over time. And yet, the reality that the building cannot stay the same as the time goes by is hitting none other than Alberti's building. The facade of Palazzo Rucellai in Florence is made entirely of fine-grained yellowish sandstone. Alberti's perfect harmony can be seen in the clarity of articulation of the facade by the use of entablature, pilasters, arches, and finally the infill. The entablature and pilasters are single units, while the arches are made of stone blocks radially arranged, and the horizontal layering of the infill is continuous through the whole facade. Today, the facade of Rucellai is not as Alberti left it. What made the compositional logic so clearly visible was the use of channels or grooves that separate individual blocks. More than 500 years later, the actual construction has emerged. Weathering on the stone surface is slower than on the mortar surface, and erosion has taken away the sharp corners of the stone blocks, revealing the actual joints. I'm talking about that, that, that. We now can see that pilasters were made of the same stone blocks as the infill. The arch is made of fewer stone blocks than the compositional appearance suggests, and some blocks actually extend from the arch to the infill. Mujo, or transience, of the building also comes not only from the materials, but also from the users and how the building is used by them. This black and white photograph of the so-called House in White, designed by Kazuo Shinohara, was published in the July 1967 issue of Shinkenchiku Architectural Magazine and was taken by the photographer Murai Osamu. Houses are art, Shinohara once stated. He would begin with the tangible realities in the everyday lives of people, but then raise them to the artistic level of abstraction. In the same way, he would study traditional Japanese architecture to extract its syntax for his design. Shinohara demanded the same degree of abstraction from the photograph. Archetypal craft pieces on the cabinet not only referred to the tradition, but also to the geometrical forms relevant to his design. The sphere of the decorative balls was a reference to the complete square of the house plan, and the cylinder of the two wooden hawks reflected the cedar column holding the apex of the pitched roof. Near the column, a pot stood on the floor, where the flowers appeared to have been casually thrown in. They symbolized Japanese history. The chrysanthemum referring to the imperial household, and the heavy pottery to the ancient civilization. When the photograph was taken, the house had already been lived in. As you have already guessed, Shinohara cleared away any obvious traces of everyday life and replaced it with the very few carefully selected articles. Shinohara brought in everything seen in this photograph except the wooden table and cabinet that had been designed by him specifically for this house. There is a postscript to the life of this house. Oops. After Shinohara's death, the house in white was moved to another site. The relocation was necessitated by the impending construction of the new street brought through the site. The owners took it upon themselves to conserve the house by relocation. To them, the cultural and architectural significance of the house was far greater than their personal concern. They hired as their consultant Shirosawa Hironori, who had worked under Shinohara before Shinohara's death. A number of changes were necessary to make the relocation possible. Many of the original building materials had deteriorated and shown wear and tear. The family composition has evolved, with the 3 children grown up and the couple aging. The building codes had changed, and the new site posed its own limitations. The house was rotated 90 degrees to fit the site. The main structural elements were reused, including the central column, but the original beach floor was replaced with oak. The gypsum board of the original wall had been finished with oil paint, while the replacement were painted with acrylic. The kitchen was completely renovated. A second bedroom, no longer necessary, was turned into a study. Now I move on to the building that take advantage of Mujo transients. My first case is Victoria and Albert Museum in London. In 1944, during the Second World War, the western facade of the museum was damaged by a flying bomb. It was left unrepaired as it was not serious and the cost would have been prohibitive. In 1985, an American innocent tourist contacted museum as the broken facade meant to him the lack of care. At that point, the museum commissioned David Kindersley, a British letter cutter and calligrapher, to produce a plaque that would explain the significance. After looking for a few unblemished stone blocks for a potential location for his plaque, Kindersley realized that the inscription would be given greater significance by being cut into the surface of the bomb-damaged Portland stone. The museum accepted this proposal, and Kindersley selected a stone immediately adjacent to the entrance and at eye level. This is an example in which the scar inflicted on the building helps commemorate a historical event that caused the very scar. As the last example, I would like to go back to Rikyū. Taian is the only extant building designed by Rikyū. Some believe that Hideyoshi ordered the tea master to design and construct the building while staying at the castle of Yamazaki nearby. Others argue that the tea room had been the part of Rikyū's residence in Kyoto, and was moved to the present location after his death, while the rest of the house was condemned and destroyed. Taian consists of the tea room of 6 feet square, or 2 tatami mats, with an additional raised floor to the north. The anteroom of 1 mat to the west, and the preparation space of another mat to the north. Where the tea ceremony can be practiced in a space of any size, Rikyū is reported to have set 4.5 tatami mats, or 9 feet square, as the largest possible limit of the ideal hermitage. In such a restricted space where even a slight change in breathing was detectable, and a careless maneuver by either the host or the guest would have spoiled the proceedings of the tea ceremony. The inconvenience and discomfort would have put the participants in a state of alarmed sensibility, making them attentive to the goings on, while a larger space, though perfect, would have relaxed them and dulled their senses. In Riku's theory and practice of tea, intentional imperfection was the leading design strategy to encourage the participant to contemplate the meaning of life. If Riku's guest was to look for beauty in imperfect object to appreciate time's passage and nature's forces on objects, the guests needed to be readied for these types of experience and appreciation. Logi, or the garden path leading to the tea room, is the place for guests to rid themselves of their desire and wills in anticipation of the pure experience of tea. Rikyu designed tsukubai, where water basin is set for guests to wash their hands in such a way that guests have to lower themselves, or tsukubau in Japanese, to wash their hands. The lowering of one's body posture here, as well as at the very entrance to the tea room, nijiringuchi, which is this one, and this is the same door from inside, and as you see, the floor level is right here. So lowering one's body posture here, as well as at the very entrance to the tea room, nijiringuchi, from the Japanese nijiru, meaning crawl, was intended to put guests in a state of readiness. Inside the tea room, the pursuit of the mind's eye was more fulfilling than one's physical eyes actually confronting a beautiful object. Once the door has closed, the outer world is shut out and Taian becomes its own world. With rice paper screen over the windows, Taian's space is not at all bright and is more like an earthly cave. The qualities of the interior space helps the guests rid themselves of their earthly desires and to concentrate their minds and spirits on the experience of tea. It does not shut out the outer world entirely, however. One can see the shadows of the window mullions changing with the amount of sunlight and can hear birds and leaves in the winds. In this subtle relationship with the outer world, the guest is once again drawn to an integration of the surroundings. That which is beyond the wall is to be imagined rather than literally seen. Rikyu's ethics and aesthetics were aimed at guiding tea participants to the ontological contemplation of the world and the self. Rikyu accomplished this by producing artifacts and environments that clearly showcased imperfection. Rikyu had no quarrel with relegating his control over form and matter to the forces beyond his control through the passage of time. The viewers even could draw parallel between themselves and these objects, contemplating their own imperfection and transient existence. I hope to have made some contribution to the questions. Seeing that transience is the truth of the world and the human existence, there are two ways to go about it: to submit to it and consider it enlightenment of the world, or to control it as to control it is the art of building and art of care. And to willfully accept the imperfection in the course of time could be to take advantage of it as a making of a historical event, as seen in the temple bell or the case of VNA, or to create opportunities for the audience to have a heightened experience of it. To do so is the subject of both aesthetics and ethics. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those wonderful papers, both of you. I'm sure that we will have lots to discuss, so I'll be taking names, hands, and names. Who would like to start? Eric, why don't you start with your...
Thanks. Thank you both so much. A year ago, I was wondering about how we might think of something like the ritual reconstruction of Shinto shrines in relation to your discussion of repair, because at first we might think, well, that's not repair because it's a whole new structure. On the other hand, if you think, sort of tying into what I was talking about, if you think about the target, right, of the conservation there as the activity, right, or the tradition rather than the physical object, then maybe it is a kind of repair. And I was just wondering sort of what you thought about that sort of application of the concepts that you're working with.
That's interesting. For those of you who are not familiar with that, she's an architect, so she knows more, but there's a grand Ise shrine in Japan, and probably one of the most important shrine in Japan. And it's as with every other Japanese architecture, the traditional architecture is wooden structure. And every 20 years, right, Shikinen Sengu, it's newly built with new material in a slightly different site.
And there are two sites, so the old one stays until this one is done.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that. Yeah. So and it's really interesting because it also calls into question what does authenticity mean, right? Because we usually wedded to the idea of authentic, material object, right, versus fake or replicate, reproduction. But you're right. I think one of the main reasons, and you can add more, is the preservation of tradition, and partly also to keep alive the ancient tradition of carpentry, because it requires many people skill. So it in a way it's if repair, the way I sort of interpret that, is embracing the changing of the object by working with it. In one sense, it can be a version of repair, although it's not, repair only part of it, which is all the examples I've shown. And also the emphasis on activity and process.
If I may add just a little bit, so of course, if you distance yourself from, the culture, you want to see it as singular thing, and it never is singular. So it's not like everybody thinks the same way, acts the same way. I think there is also in Japan the notion of renewal. And so the emperor dies, or in this particular case, he didn't die, but the new emperor comes up, and that is a renewal, and that sort of ritual is actually related to the rebuilding of Shinto shrine. So Onamesai is anyway. So renewal at the end of the year. There are some ritualistic things that people do perform, changing of the surface of the tatami mats, or changing of the shoji screen, the rice paper, is the act of renewal. So I don't know myself. I don't know if that is repair or rebirth, renewal. There is that.
No, I actually, I agree with that. I think it's better to capture that as renewal, rather than repair. Repair sort of implies that there is a thing, and then you are still working, with that thing. But it's a complete sort of renewal. I think that's better.
And somehow it is related to human life. So emperor's life. So rebirth.
Thank you.
That was lovely. Thank you. Next.
Thank you. In response to your call for examples of repair that do not contribute to aesthetic value, a couple of things come to mind. There are many others, I suspect, but One is the practice no longer done of stopgaps in stained glass windows. So in medieval stained glass windows, when sections of them break, what would be inserted into the lead panes would be pieces of stained glass window lying around in the restorer's workshop. And they had no relation to the pattern or the colors that were depicted in that area of the window. They were simply functional plugs within the window itself. Now they created a visible repair that was analogous to some of the examples you showed.
Right.
So that might be interesting to look at. And the second, also no longer practiced much, is the Italian perfection of a technique of restoration called tratteggio, which are a series of vertical lines painted into the loss, done in a restrained palette. And there are variations on this technique depending on what school of conservation the practitioner emerged from. But those are deliberate, visible repairs, and again, done for a specific purpose. They have aesthetic value, or they acquired a certain aesthetic or anti-aesthetic value, but that was not the reason for the insertion of that response to a loss.
So it's like a what? Vertical lines?
Vertical lines, yeah, and they
But
can be
very
done
specific
quite
colors?
finely and in fact difficult to see from a short distance. Or they can be done, as one critic said, like pajama stripes.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Well, thank you.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
I'm not sure I heard this correctly, but I thought it was intriguing. At one point you said, and as preparation for the tea ceremony, sweep out all the leaves in the passageway, but leave the cobweb.
So,
I think that's swell.
so sweeping of the passage means that you purify the passage, clean it, but you don't leave it clean. You let the leaves fall. So you swept the leaves already because you want to purify the passage. But you do it in advance so that some other additional leaves would fall.
But why leave the cobweb? Are you being nice to the spider?
So that's another instance. So cobweb can be seen as a deterrence of the passage, or it is the what you call it. It's the negative. You didn't clean the house type of thing, right? But you would leave it if it has morning dew on it, so that it is seen. And so you saw it. You could have taken it away to clean it, but you accepted the morning dew as something that is, say, life, that you intentionally leave it. So those are two different instances.
What if the cobweb doesn't have any morning dews?
Right, so then you would clean it.
I see. Wow.
Well, and another thing I need to say is that all those things are oral teachings. So I believe I might be mistaken here, his grandson is the one who took up on, his great-grandson is the one who took up on recording Rikyu's teaching.
Is that number?
Yes, that's number of one of them, and Gengaki is another one. So then he had to rely on his father, who is the grandson of Rikyu, because Rikyu is not dead. So is it accurate or not? and the purpose of great grandson was that he saw that Riku's teaching was reinterpreted, and he saw the danger. But at the same time, is that what he meant? We never know.
Thank you. That point about the cup made me think about the silkworm palace that we saw yesterday. Very awesome. Francesca.
I just wanted to, it's a brief comment in a way, but connecting the threads between this session and what Alva was talking about. In a way, Iso becomes like the condor and the practice of renewal and, in a way, kind of seeding generational knowledge around how to preserve Iso is the thing of, the condor can't exist unless you preserve the world that the condor lives in. So it's just a notion of
And with that, Alva has something to say.
I just wanted to share an association or thought. I'm not quite sure what its significance is, but I was very struck by, at the beginning of your talk, you asked this very sharp question: when does a thing's fragility aesthetically enhance it? And I started thinking that our focus is on the object and its potential vulnerability, or to need for repair, for example. But another aspect of the fragility is the fragility of our perceptual relation to things. You can't ever see something from all sides at once. And if you're too far away, you can't see it, even if it's perfectly intact. So there's a way in which you can modulate what the thing is for you by moving in relationship to it, or by the different, and every move we make will alter that. And so just as it's an unattainable ideal that one might keep something fixed, so it's an unattainable ideal that one might sort of unproblematically have the perfect perspective. So I just thought it was interesting to note that two things going on. And then in the end, the example about the translucent windows that you can't see through, but that in some sense, so it's deliberately, in a way, de-optimizing your relationship to the visual landscape
That's right, yeah.
as a source of value.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I don't know if this relates to what you're saying, but especially the first half of what you just said. I'm sure the audience would know better than me, but Rudolf Whitkower, art historian and art theoretician, had the term living heritage, art as living heritage. And I personally think it's a beautiful concept. So, so when art is interpreted and reinterpreted, and that interpretation is certainly different from the original. And how do you deal with that as an art historian? But he says that when that new meaning, is done in the collective, then it becomes that, and so the art object or the translation of that art object in a different built form moves on and lives on, and that is the art as living heritage.
That's really interesting. I've come to my end of my list here. I just wonder if anybody else has anything they would like to say. I might say something.
There's a hand back there.
This may be obvious. I would love to hear something. You're speaking a lot about conserving. I wonder if restoration is like the negative opposite of conserving. And I was struck by one repair that I've thought about a little bit would be, say, the Ark of Titus, which was flamboyantly restored in the 1820s, and also using a process where the repair is very visible, where they use a different kind of stone. That's the famous instance in the history of restoration. So I'm curious about the relationship of the speakers or the panel, the relationship between conserving and restoration. And in that particular instance, of course, they had to rip all those Renaissance buildings that were all around the Ark of Titus in order to bring it back to its ostensibly Roman original shape, and they put a giant plaque celebrating the Pope on it. So there's ways in which the kind of relationship of the present to the art object, and how the community may or may not make a a historical object into an art object can be less, can be a bit violent and transgressive and not fully shared. And the action can be violent and destroys other buildings, and also can be a claim of power, say, by the Pope. So I'm just curious about things where, about whether restoration and conservation are a little bit antithetical in the story.
I have an example. In Cologne, Germany, there is a documentation center of Nazi Germany. And the architect went in and wanted to make the building itself as one of the most important exhibit of that history museum. And so they decided to, after the war, the building had been reused for different purposes. So there were some wallpapers put in, a new paint painted on the wall and all that. So the architect wanted to go back to the very layer of 1945 as Nazis left the building. And so they started to peel it, right? But then they realized that they could not go to that very layer and stop their action. So they ended up ripping everything. And then what they did was they reapplied the resin paint in such a way that it is not uniform. It is irregular patterned with different tones and hues, very subtle of the color, right?
And there's a convention in painting conservation where, correct me if I'm wrong, Michelle, repairs are made deliberately visible as a way of alerting the viewer to the fact that there is such a thing. Repairs which could be invisible or could be hidden are left visible as a form of it's an ethical choice, presumably an ethical choice. So I'm interested too in how we're speaking today collectively about an aesthetics of repair and an aesthetics of decay, but according to what standards are we using that? Are we referring to aesthetics per se in that context? Because it's going to be a big issue at stake in what we have to say.
Whose aesthetic values?
Yeah.
For example, and at what point does the aestheticization of repair or decay actually radically alter the original function of an object, at which point it may or may not still be viable as such?
You showed a room that had a tall column, and then that room or house was moved.
Right.
And had been
90 degrees
shifted.
rotated, yes.
And in the post-move one, I noticed that the ceiling seemed to have, I didn't remember a beamed ceiling in the construction showing from your first shot. When they moved it, did it decide to remove some of what I'll call the plywood surfacing?
That's right. So, the second photograph that you saw is still under construction. So it's not finished yet.
So presumably
That's right. That's correct.
the beams and all, which I thought were quite pleasing to look at, will be covered.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Year ago, in your presentation, you talk about this invitation. I think yubitsugi was the term that you.
Yes.
And I was curious if you could talk a bit more about that, because the act of invitation implies one who invites and one who receives the invitation. And it's interesting because, for example, the earthquake project that you mentioned, or that you listed, it's almost as if the person who is restoring it is inviting the object to be restored, and not, and how do you see these two? And obviously there's this idea of the agency of the object or the agency of the actor, or whether that's about the relationships between them. I was just wondering if you can talk a bit more about this act of invitation.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yobitsugi, by invitation, that sort of, I think it originally referred to the object to be repaired is inviting this little chip from completely different object to collaborate to make complete object. So I think that's the sort of origin. And then with the earthquake project, so who's doing the inviting? Well, we could say I think there are two possibilities. One is the artist who is actually doing it, inviting all the pieces to put them together. But another way of talking about that might be that there are all these pieces, and it looks like they're all from the same object. So all the pieces, fragments themselves, are sort of inviting themselves to be put back together. So I don't know which, probably the second interpretation may go better with that project, so that the artist is only a facilitator and not, she's sort of taking the object, the pieces, take the lead, and so in sort of responding to that, catastrophe. So. My hunch is that may be a better, to attribute agency to all the pieces. Now, the last one of the two plates, that to me is more artist, agency. And in a way, it's a little bit too in your face. But I mean, I think I like the idea, but I wonder whether it's just too simplistic. But still, it was interesting attempt in trying to make use of the real traditional, kintsugi method, yobitsugi, the invitation. He could say that, it may be that this piece, this plate, and this plate are trying to invite each other. I mean, that would be a real generous interpretation of what he wants to accomplish. Yeah.
Well, this has been a wonderful morning. Thank you so much. Let's thank our speakers for these terrific.